Morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Christina Kepi. I'm the director of the Center for Canadian American Studies. I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. The Center for Canadian American Studies and the Western Washington University Alumni Association are very excited today to welcome you to today's webinar and welcome the class here who's here today, the History of the Pacific Northwest. It's a third-year history class. The webinar is titled The North Pacific Borderlands, Intersecting Histories of Race and Difference in Canada and the United States. Today's featured speaker is Professor Emerita Andrea Geiger. Dr. Geiger, Professor Emerita of Simon Fraser University, will discuss her most recent book, Converging Empires, Citizens and Subjects in the North Pacific Borderlands. Beautiful copy right here. Can't wait to read. I haven't read the full thing yet. I've paged through. This book examines the role of the North Pacific borderlands along the northernmost stretches of the US-Canada border that divide Alaska from the Yukon and British Columbia, as well as those that follow the contours of the BC and Alaska coast in the construction of race and citizenship in both the United States and Canada. In today's talk, Professor Geiger will argue the importance of giving Canada an equal place in our studies of both Trans-Pacific and Borderlands history. She will speak to the intersecting nature of the race-based legal constraints imposed by Canada and the United States on Japanese immigrants and Indigenous people in this Borderlands region. We're very excited again to have her with us today, not only as a guest speaker in class, but also as our fifth of six speakers of our new speaker series that we have called Why Canada Matters. This speaker series is brought to you by the generous support of the College of the Humanities and Social Sciences, Department of History, and of course in partnership with Western Alumni Office. I've got two little bits of housekeeping news before we proceed. For those of you who are joining us online via Zoom, welcome, we see you. I'm glad to see you, so many of you joining us here today. If you have submitted questions to Zoom via your registration, we do have those with us and we'll get to some of those questions at the end. However, we're looking to our in-person audience for questions first, okay? If you have questions online, you have the Q&A feature button at the end or at the bottom of your screen, and you should be able to submit any questions there as well. And also, I've got a microphone here that I'm going to pass on to our guest speaker. So let's give a warm welcome to Professor Andrea Geiger. Thank you so much.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, okay, well, thank you very much for the warm welcome and kind introduction that I've received since I arrived here yesterday. And thank you to all of you for being here today. It's great to be in front of a class of real students again for the first time in about a year, given that I retired a year ago. My thanks as well to the Canadian American Studies Center and to both Professor Kepi and Professor Char for inviting me today. Thank you for sharing your class with me. And also to the History Department and all of the other sponsors who are making this possible. I also wanted to express my gratitude to the Nooksack and Lummi people for this opportunity to visit with you today on their traditional territories. So I thought I would begin by speaking in broader terms to what Converging Empires sets out to do, and the broader framework within which the stories it tells unfold. And then use the time today to focus on elements that both touch on Canada and can deepen and complicate our understanding of the history of North America as a whole, including the intersecting nature of the race-based legal constraints that were imposed by Canada and the United States on both Japanese immigrants and indigenous people in the North Pacific borderlands. I'll also speak to ways in which Japanese immigrants position themselves in relation to indigenous people as part of a larger effort to resist white racism. So Converging Empires has its roots in two key bodies of literature. One, the increasingly rich body of literature that extends across the North Pacific Ocean to link the countries of Asia with those of North America, or Trans-Pacific history. It's a field that, as it relates to Japan, has tended to focus more on US history than it has on Canadian history. So it's focused more on ties with the US than ties on Canada. And one of the things I wanted to do is make the case for including Canada in studies of these interconnections that extend across the North Pacific to link the countries of Asia with North America. Converging Empires was also very much rooted in and inspired by the equally rich body of literature focused on border and borderlands history in North America that takes into account and provides a framework for thinking about the complexities, the contradictions, the ambiguous and uneven power relations that exist in areas where cultures and polities meet, as well as unrealized possibilities that may have existed only briefly in the past. Here as well, however, the northernmost stretches of the US-Canada border that divide Alaska from BC and the Yukon haven't been given the same level of attention by borderlands historians as the US-Mexico border and increasingly the 49th parallel. So it may be that the Alaska, BC, Yukon borderlands have been regarded as too remote or not complex enough to be of much interest. It can also double or triple the research you have to do. So you really have to love the research process to get into border and borderlands history. But if you do, I think it's very, very rewarding. And I think this northern borderlands region actually has huge potential to be every bit as rich and dynamic as border and borderlands history as it's evolved along the southern border of the United States. We just need to start looking at it more closely. So the book then began with an open-ended question, and that was simply what would come into focus if I applied a borderlands framework to this region defined by the northwesternmost stretches of the US-Canada border, and paid equal attention to both Canada and the US, where the Trans-Pacific elements of this history were concerned. What comes into focus, of course, is going to be different for different people, depending on your own particular interests, the particular lens that you bring to bear. So there's lots more to dig into, depending on what interests you in particular. In my case, I was interested in the power of borders, or the lack thereof, to impact people on either side, as well as ways in which law was used to create and maintain racial boundaries. And so that explains what I ended up paying attention to, what came into focus for me. When one examines the northernmost stretches of the US-Canada border through a border and borderlands framework, a couple of things quickly become clear. First is that you have to take British North America into account in considering where both the imperial and national borders of Canada and the US came to be drawn. Second, I quickly realized that the Pacific itself functioned as both border and borderland, and that what I call borders at sea and coastal waters were as significant as territorial boundaries in shaping relations in this borderlands region. In other words, not just the 101st meridian and the land border that divides BC from the Alaska Panhandle, but the coastal boundaries, both land and water, that also mark the boundaries of these nation states in that region had to be taken into account. And this is something you also see, as Lisa Wadowitz shows us, in the context of the watery borderlands, the watery boundaries that connect Canada and the US in this part of the world, in the Salish Sea. It also became clear to me that by the early 20th century, the presence of an expanding Japanese empire that had begun to look eastward across the Pacific in a quest for a fair share of its marine resources was also a factor that had to be taken into account. So if we switch to the next slide, one of the things you can see is that the geographic area that converging empires covers actually extends in North America from the tip of the Aleutian Islands to the US Pacific Northwest. And by that, I'm referring basically to Washington State in this area where we are. One of the things I'm sometimes reminded of in Canada is that BC is not actually part of the Pacific Northwest. It's, of course, the Canadian Southwest, right? So Canadians have a way of reminding you of this. When I immigrated there a number of years ago, but when I first got there, I learned that very quickly and was reminded of it very quickly. I also, however, touch on the Ainu homeland, which is now called Hokkaido, and other parts of the Japanese Empire where that's germane to the larger discussion. It's not something I'm going to focus on today. My talk today focuses on the area incorporated within the boundaries of the US and Canada along the North Pacific coast that became Alaska, BC, and the Yukon. So when you view it through a colonial or imperial lens, or one that centers the nation state, this part of the world, located as it is on the far edges of the US and the British empires as they evolved over time, as well as the Russian and Spanish empires at earlier stages, appears to be entirely peripheral to the issues that are of concern to those at the center. But the North Pacific borderlands look very different if we're willing to see them through the eyes of Indigenous people who made them their home for millennia, or through the eyes of Japanese and other migrants who crossed the Pacific to reach them. Long before colonial powers began to establish a presence along the North Pacific coast, it was already a complex borderlands region where the maritime and land-based territories of a wide range of Indigenous people intersected and overlapped. For Indigenous people, it was the heart of the spiritual, cultural, and material worlds in which they lived. For Japanese entrepreneurs, on the other hand, the North Pacific borderlands of North America functioned as an economic hinterland centered on Japan, a source of resources like fish, copper, timber, as it was for entrepreneurs from other parts of the world. And as well, for many, the waters of the Pacific Ocean itself were something they saw as connecting them to the Japan that they remembered, right? So not just the Japan that Japan had become, but across time as well, if you will, to a Japan that may not have existed any longer, but that they remembered. As colonial powers began to superimpose their claims on the North Pacific borderlands, new kinds of borders on various scales began to cut across it without reference to indigenous understandings of place or the bounded nature of their own territories. Not just imperial and national boundaries, but provincial, reservation or reserve, as it's called in Canada, territorial, municipal, and even private property boundaries. And I've given you a list of some types of boundaries, not exhaustive list, but just to give you an idea of the kinds of borders that start cutting across these territories over and above just the national border. So boundary drawing on all these scales played a critical role in the colonial process, all very much grounded in the law, written into law, and were an important tool in the arsenal of colonial powers used to displace and exclude both indigenous peoples and Japanese migrants. So being attentive to boundaries at all of these levels is helpful in several different ways. One of the things it does is it lets us notice moments when large-scale considerations that reflect imperial or national concerns find expression at a local or regional level. And the inverse is also true. It brings into focus moments when local or regional concerns impact policy development on a national or even imperial scale. In other words, it allows us to track events that reverberate across all of these scales. It also lets us see instances where borders on various scales were deployed together to displace or exclude indigenous people and Japanese or other Asian immigrants in both Canada and the United States. And it again gives us a useful set of tools that can help us identify some of the many ways in which seemingly distinct systems of exclusionary law and policy that targeted indigenous people on the one hand and Japanese immigrants on the other were interconnected, both on either side of the US-Canada border and across that border. So this is a dynamic you see at work in chapter 2, which I know that you read for today, and I'll come back to this. But I wanted to give you, take a few minutes to give you an example that you would encounter if you continued reading Converging Empires at the beginning of chapter 3, that illustrates the way in which being attentive to these borders on various scales can bring into focus the links between local and the global, among others that I've talked about. This all makes much more sense in the context of a concrete example. So I thought I'd really pick this one apart for you in a little bit of detail. So we can go on to the next slide. And this particular example focuses on the small town of Atlin, which is located in Tlingit territory in the northeast corner of what is now BC on the shores of Atlin Lake. And it was really only a mining camp that was first settled by miners in 1898 after gold was discovered in nearby creeks. And it's absolutely stunning part of the world. I don't know if any of you have ever had a chance to go there. It doesn't look like it. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's breathtakingly beautiful. Atlin Lake is just stunningly beautiful. And then the mountains that divide the lake from the coastal waters are just huge and beautiful. There are people who fly in from Europe every winter to spend some time there. It's that beautiful. So if you ever have a chance to go up there, very much worth visiting. Between 1902 and 1907, three separate groups of Japanese laborers brought in to work in the mines near Atlin were driven out of town with threats of mob violence. And 8 years later, the town fathers turned their attention on trying to force the local Tlingit community that Atlin had grown up around out of town. The events that unfolded in Atlin, however, were not simply a product of local concerns, local animus played out at a local level. They were a product also of developments unfolding on a variety of scales: provincial, national, imperial, and even global. When miners in Atlin learned that a London-based mining syndicate had directed the manager of its hydraulic mining interests in the Atlin area to hire 17 Japanese men to work the mine in 1902, and were told by BC officials that there was no legal basis on which these Japanese workers could be turned away. Some 150 miners decided to take matters into their own hands. They marched 12 miles down a narrow trail to the mine site, and they demand that the Japanese leave. They warn them that there will be trouble if they don't comply with their demand. They're frightened, outnumbered in a country where most didn't speak the language. And so these young Japanese men, probably about your age, agree to leave first thing the next day. And they're, quote, escorted, this is their word, escorted back to Atlin Lake, where they retrace this journey that they just completed, first to Skagway. And interestingly, in 1902, it's not yet clear whether Skagway is in Canada or the US, and then south along the Pacific coast to Vancouver. One of the curious things about these phenomena, of which there are a number at the time up and down the Pacific coast, is that the miners who drove the Japanese away posed for a series of photographs. And you see one of them up here on the right. They also congratulate themselves on what they describe as the, quote, nonviolent nature of their protest. And of course, this is a very problematic way, right, of thinking about nonviolence. I mean, a threat of violence, I would argue, is an act of violence in its own right, especially when it's issued to compel some kind of action. When you continue to look at the situation, however, one of the things you start to realize, and this is not an excuse, it's a context, is that the antagonism of local miners to the newly arrived Japanese laborers was grounded in part in the fear that they could not compete with this London-based consortium that had hired the Japanese and was trying to buy up as many claims as possible. And one of the things that complicates this is the fact that in the late 1890s, when most of these mining claims were filed, it wasn't yet clear on which side of the provincial border Atlin lay. So in other words, whether it lay in the Yukon, whether it lay in British Columbia, they knew where the line was on the map, but it hadn't yet been located on the ground until it was surveyed in 1900. Why is this a problem? It's a problem because the Yukon and BC have different sets of rules for the size of the mining claims that you could file. And so once it's determined that Atlin actually lay south of that provincial border, there's all kinds of disputing claims that need to be resolved. And of course, local miner working his own single claim and the like, would have little recourse in the event of a dispute with a London-based corporation. So this is one context. Another factor is the fact that the 1894 Treaty of Commerce and Navigation between Great Britain and Japan provided that the subjects of each, and I have the quote here on the slide for you so you can follow, had full liberty to enter, travel, or reside in any part of the dominions or possessions of the others. And this had been reaffirmed by the Anglo-Japanese alliance just weeks before this incident occurred in 1902. And this was the reason that local authorities were told by the BC Attorney General that there was no lawful way to exclude the Japanese. By 1907, when the next couple of instances that I referred to occurred, it had been decided that Skagway lay within the borders of the United States, which meant that forcing Japanese labor migrants to return to Skagway now also ensured that they left Canada. But it introduced an interesting new element into this equation that connected this remote segment of the US-Canada border to the US-Mexico border, where US immigration officials had decided to require a $500 bond from travelers transiting the United States on the way to Canada or anywhere else. So this was one way to enter the US legally in the face of otherwise hostile immigration laws. But what you weren't supposed to do is to stay. So this bond was intended to encourage people to complete their journey and to leave the US again, rather than remaining there. Ironically, however, it's one thing perhaps to impose such a bond requirement on anyone when you're transiting a continent, right? It's another thing when what you're transiting is a narrow strip of land just a few miles wide between Skagway and the Canadian border at the top of the nearby pass. And in the end, the man who had hired these migrants is able to negotiate a waiver with US consular officials based in Vancouver. And the Japanese consul is also in time able to do that for other Japanese migrants, but only on the condition that they register with the Japanese consul and also disclose where their families are registered in Japan. So what you have is the Japanese consul, the Japanese government, if you will, keeping a very careful trans-Pacific eye, if you will, on its own migrants in the context of the exclusionary law and policy that they're facing in Canada and the US. In the case of the indigenous people around which the town of Atlin had grown up, on the shores of Lake Atlin. And the municipal boundaries of Atlin had actually been drawn in such a way that their village, which was called Wena, was now located at the heart of the surveyed town site. What the town fathers did was when the McKenna-McBride Commission, or the Royal Commission on Indian Affairs, which was charged with adjusting reserve boundaries throughout BC, arrived in 1915, the Atlin Board of Trade asked the commissioners to remove the Tlingit from that village. And the reason that they made this request was that they believed that the area where the Tlingit lived might, and this is a quote, might be required for white people at some point in the future. unquote. They instead suggested that a reserve be created for them about 5 miles from town. And their reasoning is they can still come into town along the shores of Atlan Lake, they can still get supplies, but then we'll require them to go back 5 miles away from town. There's a picture of some of the Tlingit in the slide above me, standing in front of the home of their chief, who was Chief Takujak. And he testified before the commission, where he makes this wonderful series of arguments against the proposed removal of the Tlingit from the village of Wena. He first challenges the very endeavor in which the McKenna McBride Commission is engaged on the ground, as he tells them that it had no land to give them. All of the land was already theirs and had been theirs long before white miners or settlers or government officials arrived in the area. He pointed to the fact that it was the Tlingit who named all of the geographical features in the area and forced the commissioners to admit that they didn't even know what Atlan meant. Once they've made this admission, he tells them what it means is Great Lake. And he also argues that the fact that colonial officials had not changed any of these names demonstrated their understanding that it was indeed Tlingit territory. What they wanted, Chief Takujak told the commissioners, was the freedom to move throughout their territory and live on it the way in which they chose, as anyone else would want to do, not just on bounded reserves carved from a land base that was already theirs. Because the authority of the McKenna McBride Commission was limited to establishing new reserves and adjusting the boundaries of existing reserves, it didn't have the power to force the Tlingit to abandon their village. But it also didn't include Wena among the 9 small reserves that it established. The commissioners explained to Chief Takujak that the land on which Wena was located had been bought by a Catholic priest and was now private property, which belonged either to another priest or to the Catholic Church. And Chief Takujak responds very dryly. You can almost hear the irony in his voice in the transcript of these proceedings. And what he says, and again, this is a quote, "That's the way white men treat the Indians. This man, he put up his school in our place, and now he wants the whole place." There's also one more wrinkle here, however. In 1985, nearly 70 years later, a small part of the original village site was set aside for what is now known as the Taku River Tlingit First Nation. And in 2006, the Indian Claims Commission found that Canada had breached its fiduciary duty to the Tlingit when it failed to set aside the village in 1960. As it turned out, the site where the village of Wena was located had not, in fact, been bought by the priest. And it was not private property at the time of McKenna McBride Commission's visit. So there's an imaginary element to all boundary lines, right? Even if they're formally registered, even if they're formally recorded. But here you have private property boundaries that is imaginary on a whole other level, being used in real time to deny protection to an indigenous village. So what you have here, and I hope you've been able to see it as I kind of unpacked it layer by layer, is an example that connects the global to the local, that reverberates across national and imperial boundaries that gives us an example where municipal, reserve, private property boundaries were deployed together to exclude, or at least attempt to exclude, not only Japanese labor migrants, but the Tlingit, whose territory it remained and around whose village this town had grown up, right? I know that sounds very complicated and multi-part, but hopefully by taking it apart as I did, I've given you a sense of how this all works, what I mean when I make those more general statements. I think the example of Atlan also allows us to see one of the ways in which efforts to include Japanese migrants intersected with those that targeted Indigenous people in an effort to remake this and other parts of Canada and the United States as white. As you know from your reading, there are also a number of other ways in which seemingly separate systems of exclusionary law and policy that target Japanese on the one hand, Indigenous people on the other, intersected, both on either side of the border and across that border. The bodies of immigration law enforced at US and Canadian borders each had distinctive elements, but they could also work in tandem and at times were expressly designed to reinforce one another. The gentlemen's agreements into which each country entered with Japan in 1907 and 1908 to restrict the number of Japanese laborers permitted to enter each country after that date is a case in point. And in fact, Mackenzie King, future Prime Minister of Canada, assured US officials that Canada would limit the number of Japanese immigrants admitted to Canada each year once the investigation he was in BC to conduct into Japanese and Chinese immigration was complete. And he does this even though that investigation is still underway, even though he's still hearing testimony, but he's already telling US immigration officials, he goes out to dinner with one of them, what the result is going to be. So this is very problematic, you know, sort of from the perspective of anyone who is a commissioner, a judge, et cetera, right? It's a real violation of your responsibility to hear all of the testimony before you reach a conclusion. Equally as important as these national borders themselves, though, are the spaces they create and how nation states define belonging for those that are admitted. In the US and Canada, of course, citizen and subject were key categories used to exclude or marginalize both Japanese immigrants and Indigenous people. So what I'm talking here are, in essence, the borders of citizenship, borders of what it means to be a British subject in particular places at particular times. So these were also categories that often operated in interconnected ways as applied to Indigenous people on the one hand and Japanese immigrants on the other. Sometimes in parallel, sometimes, if you will, as two sides of the same coin. Coercive as these legal mechanisms were, however, neither the establishment of national borders nor racialized legal categories like citizen and subject invoked by both nations were ever solely determinative of the ways in which borderlands people constructed their own identities. They're never able, for example, to displace Indigenous understandings of kinship or place, as we saw in relation to the village of Wena, or to shake the commitment of Japanese immigrants who made the decision to settle in one country or the other to their adopted communities. I wanted to talk a little bit about the rhetorical and other strategies adopted by Indigenous people and Japanese migrants in an effort to counter these racialized legal constraints. And again, this is something you've seen and read about in chapter 2, sometimes by taking steps to reposition themselves within the shifting legal, social, and cultural spaces of the North Pacific borderlands. And this in turn can tell us a lot about both the power and the limits of law, and about the particular ways in which Canada and the US structured constraint and opportunity within their own territories as the written texts of the law itself. In chapter 2, for example, you saw a group of Tsimshian who made the decision to try to resist Canada's efforts to confine them to a small reserve in the midst of an area where they had lived since time immemorial, to move north across the US-Canada barrier as a way of challenging those constraints, only to find that the US legislators, who had promised them both citizenship and a reservation large enough to build a growing community on, didn't in fact have the power to act on their own promise. Also a factor in the background here are the parallel decisions not to recognize Indigenous people, or excuse me, Indigenous title in either BC or Alaska. This is in contrast to much of the rest of Canada and the United States. And the recognition of Indigenous title was what made it necessary to enter into treaty to acquire title to Indigenous lands. So the reason for that treaty requirement is actually rooted in British colonial law, and particularly the 1763 Royal Proclamation, which the US actually recognized that it also had an obligation under, even when it became independent from Great Britain, because it, in effect, Chief Justice Marshall decides in the early 1800s, had stepped into Britain's shoes. Because the same policy of refusing to recognize Indigenous title is adopted in both BC and Alaska, one of the interesting things is you see US officials saying, oh, BC is a useful buffer that will keep Alaska natives from learning that this treaty policy has applied in the rest of the United States. And Japan, interestingly enough, also adopts a similar policy of non-recognition of Indigenous title in relation to the Ainu after Hokkaido is formally incorporated within Japanese borders in the early Meiji period. It treats it as terra nullius, or essentially empty land. In chapter 2, we also saw people like Jujiro Wada, who dealt with the different sets of constraints on either side of the US-Canada border by redefining his role on either side, working as a guide in Alaska, given that Japanese immigrants were not allowed to apply for naturalization and were denied access to citizenship in the US. While that was not the case in Canada, because the Dominion government was bound by that 1894 Treaty of Commerce and Navigation between Japan and Great Britain that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And the result was that in the Yukon, he was able to file mining claims in his own name, whereas in Alaska, he could identify the claims, but he could only guide others to them. What BC officials did do in 1895, and we can go on to the next slide, was to amend BC's Provincial Voters Act. Oh, and sorry, I meant to, that went with my comment about Jujiro Wada. Yeah, and so we can go on to the next slide. What BC officials did do in 1895 was to amend BC's Provincial Voters Act to add British subjects of Japanese ancestry to those denied the vote in British Columbia based on the claim that BC's, and this is a quote, geographical contiguity to Japan made it more vulnerable to effects of unchecked immigration from Asia than other provinces. So in effect, right, they're treating the entire Pacific, if you will, as simply a watery boundary line, and they collapse the entire distance across it in their own minds. In October 1900, Tomokichi Honma, a naturalized British subject born in Japan who had lived in BC since 1883, deliberately tries to register to vote, knowing he'll be denied. So essentially engaging, if you will, in an act of civil disobedience. What this allows him to do is to challenge the discriminatory provisions of the Provincial Voters Act in the courts. And interestingly enough, both of the BC courts that hear his case rule in his favor based on the law as it existed at the time. This doesn't deter BC Attorney General D.M. Eberts, however, from appealing their decision to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, the final arbiter of cases arising in Canada at the time. And among the arguments that he makes is that giving people of Japanese descent the vote might erode the barrier against participation by people deemed quote unquote Indians under the terms of Canada's Indian Act in the political process. So in other words, what you see, right, is that BC officials saw the bars against participation in the political process that applied to people of Asian ancestry and those that targeted Indigenous people as mutually reinforcing. The Privy Council does indeed reverse the lower court decisions and upholds the discriminatory provisions of the Provincial Voters Act. It did so, however, only by reaching south across the Canada-US border and back in time to a source of law it normally would not have considered binding or even persuasive. And that was an outdated edition of a US legal treatise published during the US Civil War, interpreting Article 4 of the US Constitution. And based on that, it rules that the power to determine who can or cannot vote in any particular jurisdiction is a matter of purely local concern. One of the ironies here is that this principle evolved in part in the context of the debates between the northern states and the southern slave states over who would be allowed to vote, right, in the constitutional debates that led up to the US Constitution. The irony here, again, irony is a word that is very useful in the context of, you know, sort of this history. The irony here is that the US Constitution, of course, by definition, has no bearing in Canada. Any country's constitution, right, speaks to what constitutes that nation, right? So on its face, it's a document that has no bearing in Canada. It applies only to the United States. So it's a very weird thing to do, to turn to a source of law that interprets an article of another country's constitution and say, oh, well, this applies on the other side of the border. And in fact, there's another Canadian legal scholar who calls this one of the most curious constitutional somersaults in Canadian legal history because of the strange reasoning that was used to get to that result. But the consequence of it is that for the next half century, people of Asian ancestry, and this wasn't just people who were immigrants, who had been born elsewhere and were newly naturalized, but their children, their grandchildren, were not allowed to vote in British Columbia. Given the implications of a contrary ruling for Britain's other colonies in other parts of the world, whose indigenous people were also deemed British subjects, including India, Australia, New Zealand, the colony of Natal, among others, Ebert's warning that allowing Japanese Canadians to vote might also erode the bar against participation of Indigenous people in the governance of their own homelands may well have factored into its decision. So in other words, it's not being honest, I would argue, about the concerns that are really at stake, right? It's reaching to try to come up with a rationale. But its real concern is rooted in anxiety about what might happen if it let colonial peoples around the world vote, if a precedent was established that would allow that. And we see a similar anxiety among US legislators, US officials who feared that admitting the Tsimshian that you read about in chapter 2 to US citizenship might erode the bar against permitting Japanese and other Asian immigrants to become citizens, right? So we see it there in reverse, if you will. But again, what we see is that these two types of barrier are very much interconnected in the minds of colonial officials at the time. Much as Japanese and Indigenous people sought to reposition themselves at times in an effort to minimize the impact of exclusionary law and policy on one side of the US-Canada border or the other, Japanese immigrants and diplomats alike also sought at times to position Japanese in relation to Indigenous people. They also compared Canada with the United States as part of a larger effort to resist white racism in both countries. What time does the class run to?
You go till 11:20.
Okay, I have about 10 more minutes. Is that okay? I'm happy to answer questions, sort of by email as well if they come up. So if we don't get to all of your questions today, that's okay. So Terashima Seiichiro, a highly regarded diplomat and member of Japan's House of Peers, pointed to the size of reservations set aside for many tribes in the US, for example, arguing that this was something Japanese immigrants didn't require and that they were far fewer in number. So roughly only about a fifth in terms of their numbers at the time as Indigenous people then living on reservations. He points to the fact that millions of European immigrants had arrived in the US since the 1830s, and it now comprised, in his words, many, quote, small Italies, small Syrias, small Jerusalems. Why, he asks, should there not be room for Japanese in what he calls the whirling human sea that is America? Canada, by comparison, others wrote, was the more desirable destination In 1902, for example, the editors of the Tairiku Nippo, a Japanese language newspaper based in Vancouver, BC, wrote, spread before us are fertile plains and dense forests, stretching far and wide across thousands of miles, and blessed by heaven with an abundance of natural resources, over which half have not been cultivated or even fully explored. What the author of another pre-war history of Japanese in North America described as, quote, trackless virgin forests where no human being has ever set foot and which have been waiting to be explored and developed for a long time. Does anyone see the problem with this statement? What is it?
They're not trackless or virgin because they're lived in.
Exactly. It completely erases the continuing presence of Indigenous people. Yeah. So a very problematic vision in that sense. Interestingly enough, along the North Pacific coast itself, some Japanese immigrants positioned themselves in relation to Indigenous people in a somewhat different way. Japanese had a greater right than European settlers to settle along the North Pacific coast in places like Haida Gwaii, just roughly 100 miles from the coastal mainland, based on what they believed was their shared ancestry with Indigenous people along the coast, given the many fishing vessels that they felt must have washed up on its shores over the centuries. More than one early Japanese immigrant dreamed of establishing a Japanese-speaking village in Haida Gwaii, and we can go on to the next slide. The most successful effort was that of Arichika Ikeda, who established what would become the only successful copper mine in Haida Gwaii. It's located on a small cove that's later renamed Ikeda Bay, near a site where a Haida village had once been located in 1906. And one of the things that really charmed me when I first came across this example was the fact he files 47 mining claims. He names every one of them after a flower or a blossom. So lily, peach, persimmon, rose, violet, and so on. I spent hours going through books of mining claims at the archives in Prince Rupert. I came across no one else who did that. So it was really interesting. He clearly has both an entrepreneurial and a very poetic spirit. But there were roughly 100 miners, many of them brought from Japan, who lived there in what other Japanese described as a Japanese village, where Japanese was the primary language spoken. They celebrated the Meiji Emperor's birthday and Kanaday, sometimes invited local dignitaries, and even the BC Attorney General, which you can see a picture of here on the slide behind me. And in contrast to Atlin, there are actually quite cordial relations between people who live in this little village and Euro-Canadian settlers who live in a little village about 4 miles away. So for a brief moment in time, we have an example, right, that runs counter to our assumptions about how race relations had to work at this period in time. The law is getting tighter and tighter, but there are moments, right, that run counter to it. I think we need to notice those as well. It doesn't last. The mine is shut down in 1920 when the market for copper collapses at the end of World War I. But again, we catch a glimpse of something that might have created a very different world. I think we need to be sensitive to this as historians, to the same degree that we track, you know, sort of constraints that people are dealing with today to their sources back in time. Oikawa Jinsaburo, who did establish a small community centered around a fish saltery on a small island in the Fraser River, also saw Haida Gwaii as a place where it might be possible that an entire Japanese-speaking island might be established. And he only gives up on this idea when the Japanese consul intervenes and tells him in no uncertain terms he's not to pursue this. But in the interim, he makes this really interesting argument that in Canada, there are French-speaking areas, there's English-speaking areas, there's areas where other European languages are spoken. Why shouldn't there be a Japanese-speaking region? What each of these arguments speak to, of course, is the ambiguous position in which Japanese immigrants found themselves. On the one hand, active participants in a colonial endeavor who shared with their Euro-Canadian neighbors the perception of the land as empty, and yet relegated to the margins of settler society in some of the same ways as Indigenous people. I want to leave enough time for questions. I just want to cover a little bit more material. So if we can go on to the next slide. Because wives, whose numbers were not listed by the gentlemen's agreements, into which both Canada and the US had entered with Japan in 1907 and 1908, continued to immigrate through the early 1920s. Japanese immigrant communities continued to slowly grow and develop. In 1923, however, Canada unilaterally amended its gentleman's agreement to reduce the number of new male immigrants from Japan from 400 to 150, and it does so again in 1928 to limit the total number of immigrants to 150. In 1924, the US passes a new Immigration Act that also does much the same. It all but cuts off further immigration from Japan. And there is outrage in Japan when this happens, given the tremendous steps that Japan had taken to remake itself as a modern imperial nation along the lines of both US and Britain. US, Britain, other European nations had held themselves out as models for Japan. Japan adopts those models, and then it's punished for having done so. So very frustrating. And this cartoon, which was published in 1924 in the Miyako Shimbun, the Miyako newspaper, depicts the way in which many Japanese felt about the United States as both a friend and a demon, right? As hypocritical in its approach to Japan. So despite the dramatic drop in the number of immigrants from Japan, and we can go on to the next slide, exaggerated rumors that Japanese were being put ashore on remote islands along the coasts of BC and Alaska persisted. This was actually a photograph I took on my way north on the ferry to Prince Rupert. But in effect, what the press would argue is that with its thousands of small islands, fjords, and inlets, with its harsh and rocky terrain, it would be easy to launch an attack. And the press is making these arguments even before the Second World War breaks out. In fact, as a Japanese-Canadian writer, Muriel Kitagawa would later point out, these were the very qualities that protected the coast. And what we see is that military authorities agreed. And that was reflected in the minimal effort they made to defend the coast after war broke out in the wake of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. The ways in which these North Pacific borderlands were imagined, however, I would argue, helped to shape policies of forced removal of people of Japanese ancestry during the war in both Canada and the United States. The removal orders were issued within days of one another. And if we can go on to the next slide. Alaska was added to the other areas of the coast that were named in those initial removal orders by April 1942. I had this map made and wanted to share it with you today because it gives us a feeling for just how vast the area of land from which people of Japanese ancestry were excluded was. And again, this wasn't just Japanese immigrants, it was their children, it was their grandchildren, no matter how young they were, who were excluded. Some of the people who were most harshly affected by these removal orders were people of Japanese and indigenous ancestry in Alaska, some of whom didn't know they had Japanese fathers or grandfathers until they were detained or ordered to report to military authorities. And we can go on to the next slide. Yeah, and this is a photograph of one such family that was separated by the removal order. In this case, George Moto and his wife, his Inupiaq wife, are posing with their grandchildren before their three sons and George Moto were forced to travel some 2,000 miles to the continental United States, where they were incarcerated with other Japanese Americans for the duration of the war. It has a devastating effect on the family. And one of the things that's very ironic about this is some of those of both Japanese and indigenous ancestry also faced prejudice within the camps from their fellow detainees who regarded them as Indian and not as genuine Japanese Americans. We see this in other ways as well. We see it in Alaska in the rigid emphasis on Japanese blood degree, regardless of the cultural context in which children of mixed ancestry were raised. And by that, I mean these intersections I'm talking about. We see these intersections as well between exclusionary law passed on, imposed on indigenous people on the one hand and people of Japanese descent on the other, in the proposed use in BC of residential schools to house people of Japanese descent, and in the US of locating camps where Japanese Americans were detained on Indian reservations. And I am going to stop there. I hope, however, that I've been able to give you a little bit of a sense of the kinds of interconnections that come into focus when we apply a Borderlands framework that we would otherwise miss, even in a simple comparative study. So yeah, I'm more than happy to take questions.
Yeah, if we do have questions from the class, if you are able to repeat them, please.
Sure. Yeah. Any questions? Anything you noticed in chapter 2 or in the introduction, or any thoughts about contexts where you see these kinds of interconnections that I haven't mentioned? Because there's many more. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about the relationship between Japanese and indigenous people. I might be mistaken, but I think I read somewhere where the Japanese include Fushi. They also said later that they kind of considered them as like a kinship in terms of how they viewed their relationship.
Yeah, and your question is, oh, okay. Yeah, Christina just reminded me I need to repeat the question. So a great question about how Japanese regarded indigenous people and the nature of their relationships. The fact that there are stories that speak to feeling a sense of kinship, and I mentioned one of those, and also other attitudes, and I think this is what you were referring to, attitudes brought with them from Japan about indigenous people, which could be very, very negative. And there were some that were rooted in Japanese history and culture. And of course, you read about this in chapter 2 a little bit too. And how do you reconcile this, right? And the thing is, you can't, right? And I think what we have to remember is there is a range of perspectives, a range of attitudes among all groups of people, right? So people like Jujiro Wada or Frank Yasuda, who you read about, very open-minded, very engaged in indigenous culture, become deeply rooted. The Moto family, you can essentially see that George is as comfortable in that context as anyone else. And then there are also people who bring very negative attitudes with them. And also at times there is tension as a result of competition along the coast over fisheries and the like. I write a little bit about that in chapter 4 in the book. But one of the things that's really interesting, again, when you look more closely, is that there are alliances that reach across these racial boundaries. And I describe one instance where local Japanese fishers in the Prince Rupert areas basically agree to allow a discriminatory provision that doesn't let them use gas engine boats to continue as long as if fishing restrictions tighten further, they're first applied to Japanese fishers further south, right? So there can be tensions within groups, and there can be alliances across racial boundaries that we miss if we oversimplify this history. So what I actually love about it is how complicated it is, right? And I think it's such an important thing to remember. And I think that's why I took the time to share those examples of establishing a Japanese speaking community and the like. I think it's so important to remember that there were always other possibilities, that the way things have turned out were not inevitable, right? And that's what interests me about history. That's the fun part. You know, if history was just, oh, well, you know, this happened and then that was inevitable, that would be, meh, you know, I don't think it would engage me as much. But the fact that there were these possibilities and they aren't realized, that just, you know, has to be recognized as well. You know, the weight of these racially discriminatory laws had their effect and crushed these possibilities. But the fact that they existed in and of themselves is what makes this history interesting for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great question. Yeah.
I know you mentioned people of like mixed Japanese and indigenous descent. What was the nature of like marriage laws between indigenous Japanese and European colonial?
Well, there were certainly miscegenation. Question about marriage laws between Japanese and indigenous people that might have factored into the contexts in which these people lived and created their families. Yeah, and there were certainly miscegenation laws in the lower mainland. Lower mainland, the lower 48, I should say. But they applied mostly to marriages between white people and people who weren't of European ancestry. So they're not a factor. Alaska is far away anyway. And so there's not really, at least that I've come upon, a legal constraint on their ability to marry or form families. Yeah, and one of the things I think that's sometimes forgotten, and this is something that's deserving of a lot more attention from historians, is the fact that Indigenous law was still very much in operation and still is. But particularly back then, where there had been very little colonial contact by officials, you know, with some remote communities and the like. So many of these relationships, right, would have been formed within the context of what was appropriate in the context of the Indigenous law of that particular community. And I said earlier on, I think that this Borderlands region is as rich, potentially, a Borderlands region as that along the southern border of the US in terms of what we can learn about ways in which people interact, ways in which history unfolded. And that's one of the questions, one of the contexts I think could be explored in much greater depth. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you again, Dr. Geiger, for coming and speaking to this class. And I love the point that you were making about this history of our current borders not being inevitability, that there was multiple empires who were trying to stake claims. And, you know, I think going back to Dia's question earlier, like some of the attitudes that Japanese are bringing towards indigenous people in the Northwest Coast is informed by Japan's annexation of Hokkaido and their views on the Ainu people. And for some people, that this might be the first time ever learning that or reading that Japan has this settler colonialism and that there. So I guess if you just say like a last point about this not being in these borders not being inevitable. I kind of left that with students last class, and it's great for them to hear it from somebody else. Like,
okay,
how would you impress that upon us?
I would tell them to read chapter 1. But just a couple of things in response to your comments. One of the things we see in chapter 1 is different empires jostling for position. And we even see, for example, the intense resistance of the Tlingit to further Russian intrusion and Britain's determination to keep a corridor open to the Pacific are both factors that help to explain where these northern borders and even the 49th parallel came to be drawn, right? So you need to go back to that imperial stage. I think it's a really cool and interesting part of this history. The other thing I wanted to say in response is one of the things that has shaped my vision, I was lucky enough to live in Japan for a number of years when I was a kid. So when I got to university, I realized I still had enough Japanese to work with Japanese sources. The world looks really different if you read about it through sources written about immigrants from anywhere in their original language. And for example, you know, all of a sudden, the big adventure is what for people in Japan is the northeastern Pacific, right? That's, you go eastward across the Pacific, you don't go westward as you do from North America. And it reorients your understanding of place. I think it, that kind of flexibility is important no matter what part of the world that you're interested in. And I think that's also an area where so much more work could be done by people who are familiar with other languages, different European countries, African countries, India, etc., who can read about the experiences of all of these people who meet in this part of the world from the perspective of what they themselves wrote in their own language. There's things you say in your own language that you don't say in a second language, partly because there isn't the vocabulary. So I will leave it there. It's 20 past, but thank you so much. You were a great group and I really appreciated being here today.
Thank you again to all who joined us today and to our sponsors and our partnership with Western Alumni Office. Thank you to the students and of course, especially to Dr. Andrea Geiger. There's going to be a recording of this lecture that will be made available through the Western Alumni Office within a couple of days and will be emailed to anyone who registered and also available to the students here as well. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
And students, I'll see you Monday and I'll again send out